Hi, my name is CJ and this is my RC channel. So now it's time to assemble, set up, and install shock absorbers. Good, they have screws on the caps for bleeding. That's the way I prefer building shock absorbers. Yeah, they don't put any oil in them. Wouldn't expect them to ship them like that anyway. Okay. Since these don't have any place to go right now, I'm going to put them back in their bag so I know that these are ceramic bearings. I can always use them on something else, or if I burn out one of the bearings on this, I've got some spares. That's kind of still odd that they gave extras. I mean, because it is an expensive kit. Usually they give you exactly what you need, no more, no less. Just want to see what we've got here in the way of seals and whatnot. Well, that's interesting. Never seen a shock come apart like that before. Okay, let's see, we're gonna need our spacers. Because remember, one of the goals here is to shorten the travel on these. I know that sounds kind of odd when you consider that I'm putting long travel shocks in the front and having the same stuff that's in the rear in the front, and then to be shortening the travel. But the idea is that I am setting this up now for on-road, so I want to limit the travel. Now, by shortening the throw, in other words, by putting spacers in between the piston and the base, in other words, right in here, inside the shock absorber, the shock absorber can't extend as far, which means the truck is going to sit lower to the ground. So you're, without adjusting springs or anything else, you're automatically lowering the truck's suspension. And by limiting its throw, you're going to keep it from pitching and rolling as much. Combine that with a stiffer set of springs all around. It's going to give the car more of a car style suspension setup. And the reason I'm doing it here is because there's no droop. If this was like a 1/8 scale buggy or car where you have a droop adjustment where you can limit how far these swing arms go down, so you could limit it to, like, say here, that would reduce the overall travel for you, and you wouldn't need to do it at the shock absorber. Trucks and buggies, generally, their suspension travel is determined by the shock absorber. So, in other words, when I start running this off-road in the winter, when I change it around again and I pull all those out, having the longer shocks in the front is going to give me more front suspension movement. It's going to have the same amount as in the rear. And if I need to dial that back a little bit, instead of shortening the entire, getting, you know, going to the smaller shocks, I can just add a few spacers and adjust it instead of having it be a fixed point change, as in this shock or that shock. I can use the same shocks in the front and the rear and then adjust them on a per need basis. So hope that made sense. So see, the next thing we're going to want to do is get this detached here so we can get at these seals. I've really got that locked in. Okay, so there's a little wrench for that. It's not much of a to get a hold of. Get that on there, and then take this wrench and get the other one, and then start twisting, and I think now I've got it. There we go. So there is our, wonder how many seals are in there. Looks like there might just be one. Okay, so let's see, I need one of those, one of these, one of these. Those I can just set aside. So there we go. Okay, so next step is disassemble these shock absorbers completely. Okay, I ran out of memory card, and while I was switching things around, I just went ahead and rebuilt the shocks. I've got several videos on shock building. I will go over a few things regarding these shocks specifically. These are the Proline shocks, as I mentioned in my early video. I believe I mentioned this, that ideally I would have gone with a set of TLR shock absorbers, but the only way to get them was to buy all the parts individually, and that was prohibitively expensive, on the order of it would almost be cheaper to buy a kit and throw away everything except the shock absorbers and still pay less money. So in any event, these are a fairly decent shock absorber. I'll just give you some examples where I don't see them measuring up. They've taken some shortcuts. For example, the shock body itself is basically a tube. It is not a fully machined shock body. It is an aluminum tube that is threaded on the inside here. You can see this blue nut here that is extremely thin, so trying to get a wrench on that is a piece of work. And they give you these little plastic wrenches, which the plastic is far too flexible. They are not even remotely up to the job. I ended up using a small crescent wrench and a pair of pliers, of all things, to work on these, and I didn't scar them up, but still. So instead of having a machined base, they have this blue fitting which screws in, and then you have this black cap, and inside here there's only a single shock seal. For example, the TLR shocks have a base, they have a seal, which is either an X seal or a straight up round O-ring type seal. Then they have a small spacer. Then they have another O-ring or X-ring. And then they have a plate, like this little white plate here, and then a cap. So that gives you more, the place where the piston goes in, the shock shaft goes in, is longer, so there's less chance of it trying to catch an angle and press the piston against the side and bind. Okay, it wants to run straight. It's like if you take a metal rod and you run it through a washer versus running it through 6 inches of tube. The 6 inches of tube, it runs much smoother and straighter consistently, whereas the washer, it wants to go off at angles in any other direction. Okay, I know that looks kind of perverse. Anyway, but so only having a single seal instead of 2 seals, A, more chance for leakage, B, less of a smooth operating piston. Now again, this saves them money because instead of machining this shock body with an upper nut, threading, and then a complex lower section, they just take an aluminum tube, they thread the bottom piece, they carve threads in the top, and they're done. One shock body, just like that. Then a handful of aluminum fixtures, and you've got your shock absorber. So this is our shock cap. That's not a lot of threads in there. And my concern is that I might be trying to adjust my my spring preload and undo this connection at the cap and the shock body and have all my fluid dump out. You wouldn't even have to get it all the way. All you'd have to do is enough to let some air get in there, and your shock needs a rebuild. And that could easily happen if you're off-roading, where you get some mud on here or whatever, and it doesn't want to adjust easily, and as you're cranking down on it, you instead undo the cap. So the next time I rebuild them, and I probably will in the not too distant future, because I'm kind of just doing I'm spitballing the setup. I've picked 2 different pairs of springs from my my setup springs. I used both sets are from the Losi 10 short course truck. They're all-wheel drive truck, and it's one of their heavier sets of springs. It's the greens, which are 3.6 pound, and the silvers, which are 3.3 pounds. So I'm going to run the slightly softer 3.3s up front. I may try switching that. Depends on, I want to see how the thing handles, and just that'll be the first switch. You'll just be switching the springs around and things like that, just kind of getting a baseline. And both shocks were built with 32.5 weight team associated fluid, and I went with that for several reasons. I'm referencing another build, and 3.25 was the weight that they were using. I am probably using a heavier spring, but I figured I'd do the 3.25 because I have a lot of it. I have like 3 bottles of it. I got 2 bottles of team associated and 1 bottle of Losi. It's like one of those weights that they tend to package with kits. So in any event, I figured I would make use of that and get my baseline setup going. Okay, so other things that I'm not totally thrilled with about these shocks is the like I said, when I do is this cap, the little amount of thread. So when I do a rebuild, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I've got some time on my hands, like where I can disassemble them and leave them overnight. And I actually did use some blue Loctite at the base on the threads here, just because I was worried that when I tried to adjust this cap, when I tried to take the black cap off of the blue piece, on all 4 shocks, I unscrewed the blue piece, not the black piece, and I ended up having to put a pliers on the black piece, a wrench on the blue piece, and separate them that way. So I wanted to make sure these blue pieces were more likely than not to stay in the shock body if I need to make an adjustment down here. I would do the same thing on the threads on the outside here, but I would let it dry. I would recommend doing a bead on like the top 3 threads of blue Loctite, and then let it sit overnight, or you know, maybe try taking a blow dryer to it if it isn't dry in 10 to 12 hours. But let that dry on there so it's a semi-permanent resident. You know, the shock fluid eventually will degrade it and such, but that way when you put the cap on, the cap goes on tighter and it stays on, and it's unlikely to unscrew as you're adjusting preload, because that would be really bad to be like, you know, you're getting ready for, you know, to run a hot lap, you try to adjust your preload, you unscrew the shock body from the cap, spill fluid all over your car. You know, it's a mess. You've got to take the shock apart and do a total rebuild on it, and you know, it would be a very high level of frustration, and you might, you know, miss out on a heat or even a main, depending. So, you know, it might just ruin a bash session, but it might also cost you more than that, because, you know, if you've paid to race that afternoon and you can't race in the main because your shock came apart on you when you were adjusting it, that would be entirely frustrating. So I think it's a half decent shock. It's definitely above average. It's better than any plastic shock you're going to get, but it has its downsides. So keep that in mind if you decide to buy these, and take care of those things that I told you. Also, not only do they come empty, as in without any fluid, they don't put any lube on those seals. It's a little blue X seal. It's an X-shaped O-ring basically, which is nice. That helps because it's big, and they kind of skimped on doing 2 and just did one larger one instead of making this blue piece larger, having a small spacer in between 2 O-rings. They used a single chunkier O-ring. It does have more stiction even when it's lubed. Definitely use a good shock O-ring grease. This is a TLR product. It's TLR 77002. It's a nice quantity for the price. There's lots of high performance lubes out there. I have some shock O-ring grease that might be considered better than this, but since this is the first time I'm building these and I don't consider them the best shocks in the world, I didn't see any reason to spend, you know, use a $15 tub of grease that's got like a third as much volume as what comes in this. So that is good O-ring grease all the same. Losi definitely makes good products, like their thread locker is very nice. Their tire glue is excellent. I definitely recommend their tire glue. Anyway, so you know, it is what it is. You get what you pay for, and you know, short of getting a really good shock that comes as part of an expensive kit or a high-end kit, and Losi is definitely at the higher end of kits. They make very good products. I've loved their They're cars I've driven several different, a buggy and a short course, and have had no end of success and fun with them. So, so what I did was I put in 5, maybe 6 millimeters of spacers to reduce the amount of throw. As you can see, the shock is shorter than it was earlier. And then, of course, the stiffer springs, and I'll do preload adjustments later. So I'm going to go ahead and put these on and continue forward. And I was told with great confidence that the rear fits on the front. It fits. It's just the shock tower is misaligned, and stuff does not fit. At least the shocks don't. And you could probably use a ton of spacers. I'm still going to use a 2 millimeter spacer on that. And I'm going to spin these around so that the screw faces outward. Like that. That's still nice and low. Okay. Clean that off. I'm going to put a 2 millimeter spacer on the bottom of the shock as well, which means I got to take that one off at the bottom and put one on, just because it's really close to the spring. That's nice and firm. Good. Okay. Okay, now I need to mark down. See, as you can see, I've been filling this in as I've gone. So, front shock position is A and 5. And in the rear, A and 3 is what I'm going to go with. Let's see. Let's get an idea how these are going to line up here. That looks like pretty similar to the front as far as height goes. How about spacer wise? I think we're going to be okay in the rear on that. Let's do the bottom one first. I think that'll be easier. Yeah. Clean this off. Too bad I didn't have any motor spray. I need to get a fresh can of that. It's great for cleaning parts after you've built up your shocks. You get shock fluid on everything. Good. Yeah, rear might actually be a little lower in the front with that setup. We'll see. Okay. I would say by just optically measuring the bottom of the A-arms that this is going to be a nice level setup. So I picked good angles, and the spacers are good, so figure with wheels and tires on here it probably won't be much taller than that. So that's nice and low without going to extremes. Might put a few more spacers in the shocks later, shrink it down a little more. We'll see. Yeah, I think just for kicks I'm going to throw some wheels on here and just see how it looks. So it's got a little bit of droop. Front pretty much sits at the top, but can adjust that with spring. I'd say it's maybe 5% lower in the rear. I don't have a ride height gauge for off-road at the moment handy that I can get a beat on this. It's a little tall for on-road, but I mean, let's see if I wanted to bring it down a little more, mainly in front. I could do that just by swapping out springs. Put a short road spring on there, stiff front spring on there. Definitely heading in the right direction. Everything's coming together nice. Definitely need something stiffer in the back here. But sway bars will also help keep it from rolling. I mean, you want it to have some, suspension movement. You don't want it to be a rock. If it's totally stiff, it's not going to handle. The suspension doesn't do anything. That's why you want some droop. Like in the rear, if I lift this up, I've got about a 1/4 inch. You want that. You don't want to have the wheels, all the way. I mean, the suspension jacked, so it's at the top of because then there's nowhere for it to go down. Okay, suspension to work needs to be able to go over bumps, but it also needs to be able to go down to fill depressions. So you want it to kind of be in a midpoint, you know, that's why you've got to have some droop with the weight of the car. That way the suspension can go down and up and 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 down and up. Otherwise, if it's jacked and it's at the top of the shock, all it can do is move away from bumps. It can't compensate downward. There's nowhere for the suspension to go. So you're losing 50% of what your suspension is supposed to do action-wise. So just a little explanation there on suspension action. So I'm gonna swap some front springs in the morning. It's almost 4. Yeah, I got to grab some sleep. So in the morning, I'm gonna cut a panel, and I was just thinking about it, and to get the right balance on this car, this is probably the size battery I'm going to use. I'm probably just going to run 2 S's. 3 S's are probably a little much, and the car needs to be controllable. I'm gonna move some, get my weight set, or my set of scales. I have one of these, the corner weight system, and this is fantastic. Every time I break out a new car, the first thing I do when I start setting up the suspension, do the basic build and then pop it on this, and then I do it all, you know, regularly afterwards to make sure that I've got the shocks balanced right, that I've got a I don't have like all the suspension weight on 2 tires on a diagonal, because that's easy to have happen where you've got a you know, some, you know, couple of shocks a little too tight, and these 2 wheels aren't bearing nearly as much weight as these 2 wheels, or vice versa, and the car is going to be a mess to drive. It's going to be very unpredictable. So what I'll do is I'll put it on the scales, and I'll see how it balances out with the shocks at equidistant amounts of preload. And so I may end up putting the speed controller forward on the mounting bracket, and put the receiver here versus putting the speed control back here like this, and putting the receiver here, just to, because this is a fairly heavy item, all things considered. So it might be better to you know, between this and the servo and the motor, kind of break that weight up across here. Also, I have the option to move this battery. As you can see, there's some space. Right now it's in the forwardmost position. It can also be moved rearward. So I'll probably do a little experimenting with the scales and just see how things are laying out. Because if I can level things out more or less without making, you know, big changes in preload on one corner or another, versus just moving some things around a little bit, I'd rather move things around. And that's the advantage of having that panel that I'm going to cut, is that that receiver is so small, I could even stick it on the servo, so I could put this piece of weight here anywhere I want. And then of course there's going to be a little bit of, you know, a few grams worth of wire added on, but you know, this is going to weigh more than the wire, so, you know, where I put that is going to be a factor. So we'll see. First I'm going to cut the panel, I'm going to put the panel in place, drill the holes for it, and then I'll put this on the scales and kind of see where things go. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please click like, and please subscribe to my channel.